I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow.
The words were painfully simple, but their meaning threatened to change the monarchy in a single instant. King Charles had entered the private gathering as sovereign, father, husband, and guardian of an institution older than anyone in the room. Then he delivered the sentence nobody expected to hear so soon. The crown must pass now. William did not answer immediately. Camilla froze, and in that silence, an entire royal era appeared to reach its breaking point. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles knew there was no safe way to soften what came next. He told those gathered at Windsor that he intended to step aside from active sovereign responsibility and begin transferring the central burden of the crown to William immediately. The crown, in plain terms, meant the authority and duties carried by the reigning monarch, not simply the physical object worn at ceremonies. This was not a temporary reduction of work. It was a deliberate surrender of responsibility, and everyone in the room understood the difference. William watched his father finish speaking and place the pen beside the prepared papers. The prince had spent his entire life preparing for succession, the process by which the throne passes from one monarch to the next, but preparation had never included this feeling. Charles did not look relieved. He looked drained. For the future king, that small movement of the hand said more than any formal declaration could. His father was not escaping duty. He was admitting that carrying it any longer might damage the people he was trying to protect. Camilla did not move at first. Then the queen consort asked whether the decision was truly final, and the question came with more pain than challenge. Charles looked directly at her and said, postponing what he now believed was unavoidable would hurt both the family and the monarchy. She heard the certainty in his voice, but certainty did not make the answer easier. For her, this was not only about titles changing. It was about the life beside him changing with them. William felt the room tighten again when Charles acknowledged that private conversations about an accelerated transition had already taken place. The prince realized his father had been preparing quietly before the family ever entered that room. Anne noticed something else. The Princess Royal had read enough official papers to understand careful wording, and the transition document in front of Charles carried language suggesting the timing had been moved forward abruptly. Anne looked from the papers to her brother, and William followed her expression. Something had happened, something specific. The future king finally broke the silence with the question everyone now feared. What happened that made today different? Charles had announced the end of one chapter, but before William could understand the crown waiting for him, he would have to understand the people who stood to lose the most when his father finally stepped aside. Royal succession can look cold from the outside. Names, titles, ceremonies, ancient rules. Inside the family, it was something else entirely. For Charles, stepping aside meant surrendering the duty he had waited most of his life to fulfill. For William, accepting meant inheriting a burden he had spent decades preparing to carry. And for Camilla, the announcement threatened something quieter but equally personal. The life beside the king that she believed still had time left. Charles felt the contradiction immediately. Part of him believed he had finally made the responsible choice, yet another part was grieving what that choice would cost. Succession, the process by which the throne passes from one sovereign to the next, had always been treated as inevitable. But inevitability did not make it painless. For the king, this was not simply about transferring duties. It was about watching his son step into a pressure that had shaped his own life for decades. William carried a different fear. The prince understood the constitutional path ahead, but understanding did not silence the thought that troubled him most. During a private corridor conversation, he turned to Catherine and asked whether accepting the transition would make it appear that he had been waiting for his father's reign to end. She answered carefully. Supporting Charles, she told him, did not mean replacing him as a father. The future king heard the reassurance, but he still returned to the same question. Camilla faced Charles later without aides, papers, or officials between them. The queen consort asked whether anything she said could change his mind. He did not answer quickly. Then the monarch told her that some decisions become more painful when delayed, simply because everyone is afraid of the hurt they will cause. She understood what he meant. but understanding brought no comfort. Their life had already survived years of scrutiny. Now the future they thought they possessed was shrinking without warning. Anne watched the family fracture quietly around the same sentence. The Princess Royal knew her brother well enough to recognize that this was not an impulsive act. Yet she also knew Charles had withheld something. He had not reached this conclusion in a single morning, and his sister could see that William was beginning to understand the same thing. Catherine noticed the prince repeating one phrase under his breath, "Must pass now." She heard the difference immediately. Charles had not said the crown should pass soon. He had said it must pass now. Necessity was hidden inside those words, and William could no longer ignore it. Anne finally stepped toward her nephew and ended the uncertainty. She told him there had been one private incident 3 days earlier that changed Charles completely, and that he deserved to know exactly what happened. The announcement had exposed the family's fear, but the real cause had begun before anyone entered that Windsor room. And Anne was about to take William back to the moment his father decided there could be no turning back. 3 days before the announcement, there had been no dramatic ceremony, no family confrontation, and no grand declaration. There had been only Charles, William, a closed study door, and a conversation scheduled to last 20 minutes. It ended after barely 3. William had walked away believing his father was simply exhausted. Charles remained behind in silence. What the prince did not understand then was that those 3 minutes became the precise point of no return. Charles had already begun giving away pieces of responsibility before anyone called it a transition. The king still represented continuity, meaning the public appearance that the monarchy was operating without disruption. But William was increasingly handling demanding engagements and sensitive family decisions in his place. That imbalance mattered, because responsibility was moving faster than authority. The prince could carry the pressure, yet he could not always make the final call. Charles knew that arrangement was becoming harder to defend. William had raised the problem carefully during their private meeting at Windsor. The prince told his father that uncertainty could become more dangerous than change if duties kept shifting without clear control. Charles listened at first. Then, midway through a discussion about the next 6 months, he stopped speaking. The silence stretched. He lost the thread of what he had been saying, stared at the open briefing folder, and finally said, "You are already carrying what I am pretending is still mine." William reacted immediately. He tried to reassure his father that no one expected perfection and that there was still time to adjust gradually. Charles rejected the comfort with surprising force. The king told him that kindness could not be allowed to disguise reality. He had spent too long believing endurance alone could protect stability, and now he feared that hesitation was creating the very uncertainty he wanted to avoid. Then he ended the meeting early. Charles remained alone after his son left. The open briefing folder sat untouched, while the monarch stared at the same page for several minutes. Anne found him later, and understood from his silence that something had changed. The Princess Royal did not press him, but she saw enough to know her brother had made an internal decision before anyone else had heard it spoken aloud. Charles summoned 2 senior constitutional advisors that evening and asked for transition options. Constitutional advisors are officials who help the sovereign understand how royal authority can be transferred within established rules. One plan would preserve him symbolically while moving major functions to William. Another would create a cleaner, faster handover. Charles rejected the slower path by the following morning. He insisted that divided authority would leave his son carrying responsibility without the clarity to use it properly. One problem remained. Camilla still did not know how final the decision had become. Charles had crossed the point of no return alone. Now he would have to face the woman beside him and explain why the future they expected had suddenly been shortened. Camilla had accepted years of scrutiny to stand beside Charles, but nothing prepared her for discovering that the greatest decision of his reign had nearly been completed before she understood its full meaning. When the door closed and the aides disappeared, ceremony vanished with them. She was no longer speaking to the king. She was speaking to her husband, and the first words she gave him were not diplomatic. "You decided all of this without me." Charles absorbed the accusation without defending himself. The king knew this transition, the formal movement of royal authority from one sovereign to the next, would strike Camilla as more than institutional change. It threatened the life they had reached together after years of waiting. He told her he had delayed the conversation because he knew she would hear not only a constitutional decision, but the premature ending of a chapter they believed still had time. Camilla understood William's place in the line of succession, the legal order determining who inherits the throne, and she did not challenge his right to follow Charles. Her anger came from somewhere personal. She rose from her chair and asked whether her husband truly intended to surrender the role he had waited most of his life to inherit. Charles answered quietly that waiting a lifetime for something did not give anyone the right to hold it one day longer than duty allowed. Camilla pushed harder. The queen consort told him he had spent years carrying other people's needs and now seemed ready to protect William by sacrificing himself. Charles did not flinch. He said a father had to understand that protecting a son could no longer mean shielding him from responsibility. Sometimes it meant trusting him with everything. Camilla then asked the question beneath her anger. Had William pressured him to step aside? Charles rejected it immediately. In a private documented account of their earlier Windsor meeting, the king made clear that the prince had urged caution and argued against any rushed decision. The decisive recommendation, he said, came from himself after he studied what prolonged uncertainty could do to the monarchy. Camilla fell quiet because that answer removed every target. She could not blame William. She could not blame advisors. She could not blame a palace faction acting behind Charles's back. The choice belonged to her husband, and that made it harder to fight. Camilla finally asked what he had avoided. If William took the crown, what would happen to her place, duties, and the life she had built beside him? Their confrontation ended without anger winning, but that question exposed the next battlefield, because transferring a crown also meant transferring power, households, access, and authority. The monarchy could survive emotion. It had done so for centuries. What it could not survive was confusion over authority. Once Charles made his intention irreversible, private grief gave way to hard questions. Who would approve decisions? Which household would take precedence? When would William's authority become absolute? Yet amid those constitutional calculations sat one painfully human truth. Charles was watching officials prepare a world in which they would no longer turn first to him. Charles entered the next briefing, knowing the machinery had already started moving. Senior royal and constitutional officials were preparing to transfer decision-making, household authority, ceremonial responsibilities, daily briefings, and access protocols toward William. Access protocols were simply the rules deciding who could reach the sovereign, which meetings received priority, and how sensitive information moved through the royal household. These details mattered, because power inside a monarchy does not change through speeches alone. It changes when documents, people, and decisions begin moving towards someone else. William resisted any attempt to make that shift feel ruthless. The prince told officials that respecting the future could not mean treating his father like yesterday's monarch before the transition was complete. Charles heard those words and said nothing, but the restraint carried emotion. His son was trying to protect his dignity even while being prepared to replace him. One small moment exposed how quickly the change had begun. An official placed a red briefing folder on the table and, almost without thinking, slid it toward William before glancing nervously at Charles. The red folder was the monarch's confidential daily government material, containing decisions and papers requiring royal attention. The king noticed the mistake. He paused, touched the edge of the folder, then deliberately pushed it the remaining distance toward his son. William stared at it. The prince did not open the file immediately because the gesture felt heavier than any declaration. Charles finally broke the silence. "Do not make me ask twice." His voice carried no anger. That made it worse. William understood that accepting authority was no longer ambition. It had become obedience to his father's final decision. Anne soon learned from a documented palace transition account that Charles had asked for his remaining role to be sharply defined. The Princess Royal understood why. He wanted no rival center of authority, no competing court, and no confusion about whether officials should still seek his approval after William took control. Catherine discovered the cost from the other side. She learned that William would inherit decisions Charles had previously absorbed before they ever reached his desk. The future king would gain power, but he would also lose protection. Then the first real consequences appeared. Invitations changed. Briefings changed. Household instructions began carrying William's authority. The crown had not yet fully changed hands, but the palace was already behaving differently, and the people closest to Charles could suddenly feel the new reality in every door that opened for William instead of him. The most painful changes were not announced. They appeared in small details. A briefing delivered to William first, a schedule rearranged without Charles being consulted, an aide pausing outside the wrong door before remembering where authority now rested. For decades, everyone around the king had been trained to move toward him. Suddenly, the movement had changed direction, and although Charles had demanded exactly that, watching it happen proved far harder than deciding it should. Charles entered the morning room expecting the usual briefing, and immediately sensed something was different. The principal documents had already been taken to William, whose expanded briefings now included decisions once reserved for his father alone. A royal household briefing is the daily flow of official information, schedules, government matters, and private decisions presented to the sovereign. The embarrassed aide began apologizing, but the king stopped him. "Everything has happened exactly as I instructed." He meant it. Yet the pause before those words exposed how deeply the change had landed. William felt the pressure building just as quickly. The prince now received heavier papers, longer schedules, and questions that could no longer be returned to Charles for the final answer. Catherine began preparing for a larger role beside him, knowing that increased authority would bring increased scrutiny into their family life. Anne worked between both sides, making sure her brother was treated with dignity while refusing to create uncertainty about where responsibility was moving. The Princess Royal understood that kindness without clarity could damage everyone. Camilla found Charles alone later that day and recognized something had finally broken through his calm. The Queen Consort asked whether he regretted the decision. He shook his head, but his answer carried pain. Choosing to give something away, he told her, was easier than watching the world learn to live without asking for it back. She stayed with him because she understood that the monarch had surrendered control willingly, yet the husband beside her was still grieving its disappearance. William responded by changing one of his first planned meetings. The prince insisted that Charles attend, not as the man making the final decision, but as his father and predecessor. Catherine challenged him privately. She warned that turning every new responsibility into a tribute would eventually weaken the very transition Charles had chosen. If his father had truly passed authority forward, then honoring him meant learning when to decide differently. William accepted the warning. Before the next public step, however, he made one request. He wanted Charles alone. No advisors, no papers, no ceremony, and no crown between them. The machinery of monarchy had begun separating king from kingdom. Now father and son needed to decide what remained when the titles were stripped away. For once, there were no advisors waiting outside with documents, and no ceremonial language left to hide behind. Charles and William sat alone, facing the truth neither had been able to say plainly in front of anyone else. One man was surrendering the role that had defined his destiny. The other was inheriting it before he felt ready. Yet the conversation that followed was not really about power. It was about whether a son could move forward without making his father feel abandoned. William spoke first, because silence had become harder than honesty. The prince told Charles he understood the constitutional reasoning behind the transition, meaning the rules and principles that determine how royal authority is exercised. But understanding did not remove his fear. Once every room began treating him as sovereign, he worried something between them would change permanently. His father listened without interruption. The king finally told him titles could change how the world behaved around them, but neither man had to allow those titles to decide what remained underneath. William then admitted what he had avoided saying from the beginning. He was frightened. Not by ceremonies, crowds, or public expectations, but by the possibility of making one decision his father would have handled better. Charles heard the confession and recognized something familiar in it. He told his son that becoming king did not mean becoming infallible. A sovereign could still hesitate, misjudge, and regret. The responsibility was not to avoid every mistake. It was to face each one, without hiding behind the crown. William asked the question that mattered most. Did Charles regret announcing that the crown must pass now? The prince waited through a long silence before his father answered. Charles said he regretted that the moment had become necessary, but he did not regret trusting his son. The king explained through their recorded private conversation that he had personally rejected a prolonged halfway arrangement because divided authority would force William to lead, while constantly wondering whether his father might overrule him. Charles leaned into the hardest lesson. He told William never to confuse protecting the institution with protecting the comfort of the people inside it. The monarchy, he said, could survive painful decisions more easily than it could survive leaders who delayed those decisions simply because they feared hurting someone close to them. His son understood immediately that the advice reached far beyond succession. William no longer tried to argue against the transition. The prince simply told his father he would carry what had been entrusted to him without pretending the burden felt easy. Charles accepted that answer because he had never needed confidence without fear. He needed honesty strong enough to survive it. The door finally opened, and Charles walked out beside William rather than ahead of him. Father and son had reached their understanding in private. Now millions of people would interpret the same moment in public, each seeing something different in the passing of an era. Outside palace walls, private grief became public history. The announcement spread across broadcasts, phones, front pages, and crowded pavements within minutes. Some people saw sacrifice. Others saw inevitable succession, arriving ahead of schedule. But across every interpretation ran the same feeling. Something familiar had shifted. Charles was still present. William was still his son. Yet Britain was suddenly looking at both men differently, and neither could ever completely reverse that change. William watched the first wave of coverage with Catherine beside him, and the language unsettled him almost immediately. Broadcasters described the prince as the new center of royal life, while palace communications stressed continuity, meaning the deliberate effort to show that the monarchy remained stable even as authority changed hands. Catherine heard the tension in his breathing before he spoke. She switched off the television and reminded him that public language would always move faster than private emotion. He could become the focus of the institution in a day, but becoming comfortable with what that meant would take far longer. Charles faced the opposite pain. The king heard crowds beyond the palace gates, chanting William's name, and pride arrived beside something he did not want to call grief. Camilla remained close enough to recognize the change in him. The queen consort reached for his hand when no one else was near, and held it without speaking. He had chosen this transfer himself, yet hearing the country turn emotionally toward his son made the sacrifice real, in a way documents never could. Buckingham Palace became the center of that public emotion. Evening crowds gathered against the railings, as newspapers appeared carrying the stark fictional headline, "The Crown Passes." One front page showed Charles and William leaving their private meeting side by side. Buckingham Palace is the monarch's principal official London residence, and one of the clearest public symbols of the crown. That single image carried enormous force, because neither man appeared triumphant. The father seemed to be releasing something. The son seemed to understand its weight. One broadcaster changed the tone of the national conversation with a single description. During a televised analysis, he called the event a king choosing the moment of departure rather than allowing circumstance to choose it for him. The phrase spread quickly because it transformed the story from defeat into sacrifice. Charles was no longer being discussed only as the monarch stepping away. He was being seen as the father who had decided that protecting stability required surrendering control. William heard that framing later and stayed silent. Catherine watched him absorb it, knowing the next words would belong to him alone. By nightfall, Britain had interpreted Charles's sacrifice. Now only one thing remained: to understand what the transfer truly meant when William finally stood where his father had stood before him. In the end, the most important image was not a crown, a signature, or a palace balcony. It was a father, recognizing that duty had changed shape. Charles had spent most of his life waiting for the throne and far less time occupying it than history once seemed to promise. Yet his final defining act in this dramatized story was not holding power. It was releasing it, deliberately, painfully, and with enough certainty to tell his son, "Now it is yours." William accepted that responsibility, without pretending he could become a copy of his father. The prince understood that continuity meant preserving the stability and duties of the monarchy, while allowing leadership to change with a new sovereign. He honored Charles, but he accepted that his own judgment would now stand on its own. That mattered because loyalty could not become imitation, and respect could not become hesitation. Charles moved into a quieter role with defined responsibilities, remaining part of family life without competing with William's authority. The king had spent decades moving toward the center of royal duty. Now he was choosing the discipline of stepping away. Before his son's first major appearance, he reached over and adjusted William's cuff instinctively. Neither man spoke for several seconds. In that small gesture, monarchy became family again. Camilla felt the bitterness of the transition soften into something steadier. The queen consort had fought the timing, questioned the secrecy, and feared what the change would take from them. Now she chose loyalty over resentment. She stayed beside Charles as he entered the quieter chapter he had accepted, understanding that their years together were not erased because their public roles had changed. Anne understood her brother's decision with clarity. The Princess Royal saw that Charles had not stepped aside because the monarchy meant less to him. He had stepped aside because preserving it mattered more than preserving his own place at its center. That was the sacrifice beneath everything. William carried the final lesson with him. The prince understood that inheriting the crown did not mean defeating the generation before him. His father's surrender of authority had become one last lesson in kingship. Power had value only when someone knew when to use it, when to share it, and when to release it. And so Charles's words, "The crown must pass now," became more than an announcement. They became his final statement about duty. Power was never truly his to possess forever, only his to carry until the moment came to place it, willingly, into William's hands. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.